Ghost train outside. The wind howled through the gnarled branches, creating an eerie sound. Inside the old wooden house, the flickering fire cast a warm glow in the corner of the kitchen, sending warmth seeping through the thin floorboards. The smell of burning wood filled the cozy space, making Jason snuggle deeper into the worn armchair. The boy, with his bright, wide eyes, watched intently as Grandma Margaret, his beloved grandmother and the one who always told him the spooky stories he adored, stirred the pot of soup over the fire. Grandma Margaret, with her aged but steady hands, stirred the pot, her hoarse yet warm voice rising above the crackling flames, tinged with a hint of mystery. "Tonight, Jason, I'm going to tell you about something different, something very few dare to mention." Jason sat up, excitement sparkling in his eyes. "What story is it, Grandma? Is it about ghosts again?" She chuckled softly, her laughter mingling with the sound of the crackling fire. "Yes, but not the usual kind of ghost. This is the story of a ghost train that appears every night at the old abandoned station." The boy shifted uneasily, a shiver running down his spine from the chilling tale. "An old train station? But there aren't any trains running through there anymore." Grandma Margaret set down the spoon, her aged eyes sparkling with a distant look, as if she were gazing through time, back into the past. She began her tale. It was an old train, long inactive for many decades. But the strange thing is, every night when the moonlight filters through, people claim to see that train appearing at the abandoned station. A worn-out train, yet its lights shine brightly, with shadowy passengers boarding. No one knows who they are, but one thing is certain: they are not the living. Jason shuddered slightly, trying to keep his voice steady. "And what happens to those who board the train, Grandma?" Grandma Margaret's expression turned serious, her voice dropping to a low whisper. "They believe they're being taken far away, but in reality, after a journey through the darkness, they're found the next morning, sitting under the big tree by the station, exhausted, drained, and unable to recall where they've been." The firelight danced in Jason's eyes as he sat silently, captivated by the flickering flames, his imagination soaring with his grandmother's peculiar tale. He could almost hear the distant whistle of the train echoing, faint and haunting. Grandma Margaret tilted her head, peering deep into the boy's eyes as if assessing his reaction. "Jason," she whispered, "not everyone is lucky enough to return. Some never come back." The story began to spread an indescribable chill. All the sounds outside seemed to fade into silence. The crackling fire in the stove popped softly, as if counting each second passing. Jason took a deep breath, his mind filled with images of that old train, where passengers never returned to the world of the living. Would you? The journey of the mysterious passenger. On that day, Samuel Turner, a middle-aged man from the southern United States, was searching for a place to rest after a long, exhausting journey. Dust from the road covered his shoes and luggage, and his worn-out coat hung loosely with each slow step. As night fell, the cold seeped into his bones, making Samuel yearn to find a place to stay. As Samuel approached a sparse forest, he noticed a faint light in the distance, emanating from the old station the locals had mentioned. "Maybe it's a train," he thought to himself, hoping to find transportation to continue his journey. The dim lights of an old train appeared through the thick fog, seemingly waiting for passengers. Samuel slowly walked closer, a strange feeling creeping into his heart. The train stood still as if waiting for decades, yet it glowed brightly from within. The foggy windows reflected a faint light, and through the thick glass, he could see shadowy figures of those who had boarded the train. Without thinking much, Samuel stepped onto the train. The atmosphere inside was bizarre and hard to describe. The passengers sat in silence, each in their own posture, yet none communicated or looked around. They had a hazy, indistinct appearance, not quite clear like ordinary people. Their eyes were cast downwards, their faces bowed, utterly still as if they were lost in another world. Samuel tried to reassure himself, thinking perhaps he was just too tired after the long trek. But something felt off about this space. The passengers on the train resembled moving shadows, quiet and ghostly. Minutes passed, and Samuel heard footsteps approaching from a distance. A man in a worn-out uniform, bearing the marks of time, came closer. He seemed to be a train attendant. The attendant merely nodded at Samuel without saying a word, extending his hand to collect the ticket. Samuel fumbled in his coat pocket, retrieving an old silver coin and handing it to the ticket collector. But what shocked Samuel was the face of the ticket collector. The dim light revealed vague, indistinct features. It was as if his face was obscured, devoid of eyes, nose, or mouth. Samuel shuddered, yet he could not speak. The ticket collector pocketed the coin and moved past him, leaving an unsettling, eerie feeling in the air. The train began to move. The wheels clattered along the tracks, carrying Samuel and the strange passengers further into the night. Samuel wondered where he was headed, but the light outside the window began to fade, giving way to thick darkness. Looking out, all he could see was an endless void, as if the train were traveling to a place where light could not reach. The train continued to surge forward, its wheels rolling steadily on the tracks in the stillness of the night. Samuel leaned back in his seat, exhausted, and gradually drifted into sleep. His eyelids grew heavy, and for a few moments, his consciousness slipped away from reality, drifting into another realm. In his dream, Samuel found himself still sitting on the train, but this time the scenery outside was clearer. The train raced along a wide river. The water's surface reflected the dim moonlight, eerily calm. The dense trees along the riverbanks swayed gently in the wind, creating a soft rustling sound. Suddenly, a deafening explosion shattered the peaceful atmosphere. Samuel jolted awake, his eyes wide with panic as he looked out the window. He saw clearly that the bridge ahead had just been destroyed, splintered wood and metal flying down into the dark river below. The train barreled forward at an unstoppable speed, and Samuel felt the moment. The moment the train lost control, he screamed in despair as the entire train plunged straight into the murky waters below. The screech of metal scraping against metal, the wind howling through the cracks in the windows, all blended into a horrific cacophony. Samuel was thrown from his seat as the train fell freely, everything around him spinning violently, then abruptly stopping as water surged into the cabin. Cold and damp, the water quickly submerged the entire train compartment. Samuel frantically pounded against the glass, trying to escape this suffocating trap. He felt the icy water seeping into his skin, rendering his body numb. The screams of the other passengers echoed throughout the train, but they were all drowned out in the flood. They struggled, calling for help in vain, their sorrowful eyes pleading with Samuel through the murky water. With a strange surge of strength, Samuel finally broke through the glass. Water rushed in more violently, sweeping him outside into the depths of the dark water. Samuel thrashed about in panic, his hands instinctively grabbing onto anything he could find. Luckily, a piece of driftwood floated toward him. He clung to it tightly, feeling the wet and cold seep into every inch of his skin. The current carried him downstream, where he saw a multitude of lifeless bodies bobbing along. These soulless forms, devoid of life, their faces contorted by the merciless water. Luggage lay scattered, chaotically floating on the surface of the river, like fragments of a world that once existed. Samuel gasped for breath, the sound of the cries for help still echoing in his mind. The sorrowful eyes, the desperate gazes of the passengers unable to escape, all haunted him with every heartbeat. As the water swept him further away, the horror and sense of helplessness weighed heavily on Samuel. He had no idea where he would drift to, only that he was lost in a nightmare, with no escape. Samuel bolted upright, cold sweat pouring down his forehead. He sat up straight, taking a deep breath. It was just a dream. The chilly night air outside had made him dream of falling into a river. The old coat hanging nearby was pulled over him in an attempt to shake off the cold seeping into his skin. But the train kept rolling steadily. Samuel turned over, trying to close his eyes and fall back asleep. It was all just a dream, he told himself. However, this time, sleep did not come easily. The images from the dream haunted his mind, each scene etched deeply into his brain. After a while, the train came to a stop at a bustling marketplace. The hum of voices and lively chatter filled the air. Samuel glanced out the window and saw a crowd jostling about, bustling with activity. Stalls lined both sides of the road, and people pushed against each other to shop. The sounds of vendors calling out and the clinking of goods created a chaotic symphony. Unable to resist his curiosity, Samuel stepped off the train. The market was alive with energy, filled with booths selling everything from fresh fruits to clothing and jewelry. He walked slowly through the throng, taking in the sights around him. Yet from the very beginning, something felt off. The people in the market appeared hazy and indistinct. They moved about, but their faces were not clear. Whenever Samuel tried to focus on someone, their forms seemed to dissolve into the thick fog. Samuel paused in front of a stall selling pastries and purchased a small cake from the vendor. He reached out to take it, but as the vendor handed him the pastry, Samuel suddenly sensed something was wrong. The vendor's hand felt ice cold, as if it had just touched a corpse. He jolted back at the sight of the vendor's jagged teeth, horrifying and monstrous, as if they did not belong to a human. Yet, the vendor's eyes were entirely invisible, as if hidden behind a dense mist. Trembling, Samuel took the pastry, but upon touching it, he realized it was frigid, like a solid piece of ice. He withdrew his hand, startled, and stepped back, his eyes wide with disbelief. Standing there for a moment to steady himself, Samuel turned and tried to walk away, hoping to escape what he had just witnessed. He maneuvered through the chaotic crowd, but this time something even more unusual occurred. A child suddenly appeared, clinging tightly to Samuel's leg. The chilling sensation of the little hands made Samuel freeze in place. He bent down to look and immediately felt a wave of dread wash over him. The child had no head. But strangely, he could still hear its faint voice whispering right beside him. "Uncle, can I have something to eat? I'm hungry." Samuel's heart raced. He jumped back, struggling to break free from the headless child clutching his leg. The tiny fingers gripped him tightly, rigid and cold, showing no signs of letting go. Samuel's legs went numb, yet he fought with all his might to drag himself away from this. Samuel jolted awake, his heart pounding, cold sweat soaking his skin. He struggled to take deep breaths, his chest rising and falling in an effort to regain a normal rhythm. "Oh God. It was just a dream," he whispered to himself. The dream had felt so real and horrific, as if his body was still trembling from the chill of the headless child. The train continued to speed along, the wheels grinding on the tracks, creating a steady screech. Outside the window, the scenery kept changing, but this time Samuel was too exhausted to care. He slipped back into sleep once again, seemingly swept away in a whirlpool of irresistible fatigue. In this dream, the train carried Samuel past beautiful skyscrapers, towers glistening under the moonlight, shimmering like a city out of a fantasy. But the strangest thing was that in the sky, instead of birds soaring freely, Samuel saw flocks of hideous black crows. They circled above, then dove toward the train, emitting horrific caw-caw sounds that sent chills down his spine. Thud, thud. The sound of heavy impacts echoed against the window as the crows crashed into it at terrifying speeds. Their blood splattered, leaving red streaks across the glass. The scene was too horrifying. Samuel felt utterly bewildered, trying to see through the blood-smeared glass to understand what was happening. He furrowed his brow, trying to focus more closely, but the scene outside had shifted. No longer were there stunning skyscrapers. Instead, before Samuel lay a vast graveyard, filled with countless tombstones jutting up haphazardly, stretching into the horizon. The old gravestones, some tilted, created a bleak and eerie sight. The wind whispered through the graveyard, carrying the soft rustle like the murmurs of lonely souls. Samuel felt an overwhelming wave of terror swell within him, as if he were witnessing something he should not see. His body felt numb, unable to move, unable to scream. It was all just a horrific nightmare with no escape. Suddenly, everything went dark. Samuel awoke again, his heart racing. The train continued to roll smoothly as if nothing had ever happened. There were no crows cawing, no birds crashing into the glass. Samuel sat motionless for a long moment, trying to discern what was real and what was a dream. The images intertwined, overlapping in his mind, leaving Samuel even more confused. Am I still sane? Samuel wondered doubtfully. Had everything he just experienced been real or merely a product of his imagination? The train pressed on, but Samuel was certain that the dream, that horror, was far from over. Samuel continued his journey on the mysterious train, his gaze foggy as he looked ahead, still haunted by the horrifying dreams that had not yet faded away. Suddenly, a loud explosion erupted. Bam! The train shook violently, and before his eyes, everything ignited in an instant. Flames spread rapidly throughout the cabin, the heat rising intensely. Flesh flew apart, body parts scattered everywhere. Samuel was trapped in the train car, screaming in desperation, but his cries for help vanished into thin air. He struggled against the fire, trying to escape the raging blaze. But every effort seemed futile. The flames engulfed him, drowning Samuel in despair. He felt excruciating pain, as if his skin were burning away. Suddenly, everything turned dark. Samuel jolted awake, drenched in sweat, gasping for breath, his heart racing. The sun was high in the sky, casting bright rays onto him, making him feel hot. Samuel took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. But the memory of the nightmare he had just experienced, so vivid and terrifying, lingered in his mind, refusing to dissipate. There was no train. Samuel looked around, realizing he was still lying beneath the old tree, next to the long-abandoned train station. The horrific nightmare he had just endured was now merely an imprint in his mind, but it sent shivers down his spine whenever he recalled it. Everything had been so horrifying. His entire body felt drained, as if he had just spent a night tormented in hell. Samuel quietly sat up, his body limp, unsure whether what he had just gone through was merely a dream or reality. It had been a terrifying dark night that he would never forget. As Samuel was about to stand up, a raspy voice echoed, causing him to turn around. An old woman, a strange figure he had heard about in childhood stories, stood before him. She wore an ancient outfit, her long white hair flowing down, her deep-set eyes and piercing gaze seeming to look straight into his soul. "Have you heard?" she spoke, her voice resembling the wind rustling through the leaves. "The story of that train." She pointed toward the old station where Samuel had been lying. Long ago, there was a train that passed through here. That train was struck by a bomb. Samuel froze. A wave of fear surged within him, as if the ghostly woman were reminding him of what he had witnessed in his dreams. Many people died, she continued, her voice heavy with sorrow. They could not move on. Their souls linger here, full of resentment and pain. He looked around, feeling the oppressive atmosphere enveloping the area. The townsfolk know this story well, so no one dares to come near at night, the ghostly woman added. Only those who are unfamiliar from distant places dare to spend the night here and endure the horrors. Samuel was astonished, afraid to breathe too heavily. Stories of unsuspecting travelers encountering vengeful spirits had become legends in the region, and now he was a part of it. And when he looked back, she had disappeared without a trace. At that moment, Jason's pale face trembled with fear. But, Margaret continued, every night that ghost train still runs, she emphasized, her voice echoing with intensity. It comes to collect the lost souls and carries them into the dark night. Samuel couldn't suppress the terror rising within him, and a part of him wanted to flee from this place. But another part held a curiosity, a desire to understand what had truly happened. The story of that train made him feel as though he had fallen into an endless nightmare. He knew that this journey would not only be a quest for the truth about the train, but also a confrontation with the very hauntings in his soul.